Okay, let's talk about the human body. All right, first things first, before I dive in on the actual lecture, I always want to talk a little bit about this guy. Anybody recognize this fellow? Seen him before? You've probably come across him at some point in your life. He's known as the Vitruvian Man. You find him a lot on like hospital walls or in fitness settings. Sometimes you'll see him there. He was first illustrated or drawn up by a fellow by the name of Leonardo da Vinci, very famous artist, also just an incredible, successful inventor and scientist. He was super interested in the human body, and he drew this guy up and used him as a way of kind of describing the human body and relationship that exists between us and the physical world, which is really cool. I think it's really neat. You could actually Google it and find out a lot of information about it. It's not something I'm going to include, but or get into any more detail than that. But I always include him just because he's kind of the official or unofficial mascot of the human body. So you'll recognize him, I bet, going forward quite a bit out in the world outside of this class. Was there anybody that wasn't here the other day? If you weren't here, you wouldn't have gotten this lecture, so you might. Was there? Did you need one?
Yeah.
I have a couple lectures. So. Okay. So first thing I want to just do is define anatomy, and then I'm also going to define what physiology is. Okay, two principal things that we're going to be studying in this class. These are two branches of science that provide the foundation for understanding the body's parts and functions. Obviously, human anatomy, we're focusing on that in this class, is the study of structure of an organism and the relationship of its parts. Notice I bolded in the word structure. Whereas in physiology, we're studying more so the function of the organism. So in this class, we're going to be doing a lot of identification of parts. Okay, memorization is a big key with this class, being able to identify and label different things like I talked about in the first day handout. Okay. You can study anatomy in a lot of different manners and in a lot of different levels. Gross anatomy is something that's describing the way that the body parts are visible to the naked eye. Like I look around the room, I can see hair color and skin color and eye color, and you can do the same looking at me. Gross anatomy, not gross as in, ew, that's gross, we're dissecting it, refers to the fact that you can see it without the help of a microscope. Okay. For a lot of the parts of the body, you cannot visually see them without a microscope, like our cells and our tissues. Okay. Microscopic anatomy would be involving the study of cells, what we call cytology, and tissues, what we call histology. One thing you guys are going to grow to understand in this class, and really the same can be said for a lot of science classes, is really dealing with learning a new language. Okay. A lot of the words that are used in science relate not to the English language, but to like Latin roots. Okay, and in this class, you're going to come across a lot of long words where you've got prefixes and suffixes. Okay, with the beginning part of the word and the ending part of the word. Okay, you notice there at the end of both cytology and histology is the suffix ology, which is a suffix that means study of. Okay. Cyto, I bet you can figure out, means cell. Histo, I bet you can figure out, means tissues. So if you break down words, if they're super big or you don't know what they are, sometimes it makes it super easy. Of course, you guys have the benefit of a cell phone right next to you at all times where you can just Google what a word means. But obviously, you won't be able to do that on exam days. So my advice when you're coming across these terms that you don't know, try to break them down, okay? What we do in lab a lot of times is comparative anatomy. Like I said, we would try to dissect in this class like a sheep heart and a sheep brain and compare them structurally to what we have, okay, as far as hearts and brains go. Physiology, as I said, is going to deal with the function of a living organism and its parts. And just like anatomy, we can look at the different levels there, whether it's the type of organism involved. Obviously, we would study plant physiology, which you really could. Obviously, we're going to introduce in this class human physiology. You can look at it at the organizational level, which we're going to talk about the levels of organization here on the next slide, whether that's molecular or cellular as examples. What we do for the most part this semester is go system by system, and I'll talk about what systems are, like the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, that are listed there in the example. Table 1.1 here at the bottom is a table that you would find in your textbook. If you were to actually open it up and look inside, you would be able to see this table. Looking at the left here, there are selected branches of anatomy. On the right, there are selected branches of physiology. A lot of times I include stuff from the textbook and I say, don't worry about it. This would be an example of that. Okay, so this is not a table I'm going to ask you to know. Really only included it because it was in your textbook. There's some cool information in there, but it's nothing I'm going to ask you to memorize anything like that for the exam. All right, you didn't get it all. I'll be back down, I promise. One of the probably most obvious things coming into this class, having probably very little or no knowledge whatsoever about human anatomy, is just from living and understanding what we know about ourselves is that we're complicated organisms. An organism is a living and functioning being, whether that's us as a human or the plants that grow or the bacteria that live in our gut. Okay, all living things are super organized and super complex. Okay, we can describe our organization and break it down into 6 levels. Okay, not all organisms are as complicated as we are, like the bacteria that live in our gut, much less complicated, but they all at least have some level of organization. We have 6 levels. Now, starting here at the top would be the smallest and simplest level of organization. So what we're doing is climbing a ladder up to number 6, the most complicated, and the sum total of everything. Okay. Starting at the top here, the chemical levels, where you're looking at atoms and molecules. An atom is described as the smallest particle with a unique identity. And I imagine many of you guys have taken a class where you had to learn about like the periodic table of elements, okay, which is that big table with the boxes with letters and numbers in it. Each box represents a different element, like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen that I list off, since those are the 4 primaries that make up 96% of us as living beings. Each of those boxes represents, what a singular atom of that element would be, complete with things like protons, neutrons, electrons. We don't really talk too much about those in this class, other than really kind of right now. So for those of you kind of figuring out already, don't, because we're not really too worried about that in this class, okay? We do talk a little bit about things like water, and glucose and DNA. Not a whole lot, but those are examples of molecules which are formed when two atoms or more come together, like H2O, which we all know is water. Okay? C6H12O6, which is glucose. Okay? Those are very, very important things. If you were to look inside of us, you wouldn't just be able to find carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen by themselves. We all know calcium is a strong component of our bones. Calcium is not the only thing in our bones. Most of the time, elements come together by forming these things called molecules. Okay? And those can build together and combine, forming what we call organelles, which include things like the nucleus of a cell or the powerhouse of the cell. Okay? Things that we'll be talking about on Monday when we move on into our cells lecture. Okay? Other examples of organelles include ribosomes, the endoplasmic reticulum, lysosomes, peroxisomes. Okay? Things you probably learned about like when you were a freshman in high school, or if you've taken other classes like biology. Here at Highland. Those are basically just tiny little functioning structures inside of our cells, which brings us to the cellular level. Cells are the smallest and most numerous structure units, possessing and exhibiting the basic characteristics of living matter. Okay. Essentially, everything that gets done and we are able to do is because of the activities of our cells. It's pretty amazing. We are made up of trillions upon trillions of cells. And that's pretty darn amazing considering we started our life off as a single cell when sperm and egg unite, forming what's called a zygote. Now, cells are usually composed of many different organelles, like I just mentioned, but are not individual structures. They instead are combined and form what we call tissues. Okay? Tissues are defined as a group of similar cells that develop together to form the same growth structure. If you want a just kind of simple definition of a tissue, it's just a group of cells that work together. Okay? Our third lecture of the semester, which we'll get into next week, is all about the four major types of tissues that our body has. Epithelial is the type of tissue that forms like the outside of our skin, inside of our stomach and mouth, our sweat glands. Connective is a variable type. Lots of different connective tissues exist. Bone is a form of connective, blood, fat, cartilage. And so there's a lot of different functions there. Muscle, which allows us to move when we contract our skeletal muscles or move stuff inside of us by way of our smooth muscle and our cardiac muscle. And then nervous is the type that carries information from one part of the body to another very rapidly through nerve impulses. This is what makes up like our brain and spinal cord. Like I said, we'll get into more about those tissues next week. Okay. You take a couple of those or more and you can form organs, which you can see definition of an organ is a structure made up of several different kinds, at least two tissues arranged so that together they perform a special function, like the brain that I just mentioned, your heart that I've mentioned, your stomach, your bones. Each bone would be a kind of organ, pancreas, so on and so forth. Your skin is even an organ, which is really cool. Okay. Each of those organs belongs to at least one type of, or one of our systems. A system is defined as several organs ranged so that together they can perform complex functions. In our figure here at the bottom, we show all the different all the different organs that make up our digestive system. And that's what we do after we get through these first lectures and this is how we attack the class, we build up to the point where we're going to start talking about organs, and we go system by system. There are 11 systems of the body, and we'll talk about every single one of them. Some of them we spend, just a day on or two. Others we spend an entire unit. Like the integumentary system is like 11 slides. That's it. An entire unit 2, 4 lectures, is all about the skeletal system. So we spend a different amount of time on each system. And then by the end of the semester, we'll have talked about all of them, which means we've learned everything there is to know about us, the organism, the sum total of all those structural levels working together to promote life. Now, I told you guys in our kind of introductory class period last week that we're going to be doing a lot of identification of parts. And I've included a labeling packet for each unit, and I passed that one out here this morning, or afternoon, I guess it is now, for you guys to work on coming into first exam. As we go through these lectures, you're going to see a lot of pictures. Okay, I can tell you right now that a lot of pictures will be on your exams. A lot of pictures won't be. Okay, my advice is assume if it's in your lecture that it will be on the exam unless I tell you otherwise. Okay. The picture here at the bottom of this page is not 100% tell you right now, not something you need to worry about for exam 1. Okay. Doesn't mean you have to scribble it out or anything like that. I'm just telling you it's not a picture that's important to study. It's just an illustration in your textbook. That it's kind of handy, kind of help coincide with the information there. So don't worry about knowing that picture. Okay, as I told you guys, once we get through these first 3 lectures, we go system by system. And I said that there are 11 systems that make up the human body, us. Okay, and we're going to cover each of them in varying amounts of detail. What I have included here is a table I just basically created with the obviously name of the system on the left. Middle column tells you what organs belong to that system, and then just a very brief general description what that system does for us. So the function of that system or functions. Had this been something super, super detailed, it would be as thick as your textbook, okay? Because, obviously, this is very, very brief in explanation. Not something I'm going to ask you to know for the exam. I included it just to kind of help you get a feel for what we're going to be talking about. And it is the exact same order that we will cover it this semester. The last lecture of Unit 1 is the integumentary system. And we'll spend Unit 2 talking about the skeletal all the way down to the last system, or systems, really, the reproductive, because I should say systems, because male and female are completely distinctly different. So not something I'm going to ask you to really spend a whole lot of time focusing on. I just wanted to kind of present it to you. Is everybody good? Everybody get them all filled in? All right, let's move on. Finally start identification and memorization. All right, let's talk anatomical position. One thing that we do a lot of in this class, and one thing that's done a lot in just the field of anatomy, is describe where things are in relation to one another. Where the heart is compared to the lungs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. In order to do so, you have to have this starting point. Okay. We call this starting point anatomical position, which our lovely lady at the bottom is doing a pretty good, perfect, I should say, job of doing. Okay. Here in the left side of the page, she's, we can say she's standing up or laying down, doesn't really matter. Let's say she's standing up. So she's standing erect, meaning that her legs are straight. She's vertical, not bent over the waist or anything like that. Her feet are flat on the floor at shoulder width. Okay, her arms are down at her side and her palms are facing forward, along with her face straight ahead. Okay, not turned to one side or the other. Okay. Those are all key features of anatomical position. Another important aspect or concept to understand is that, for example, when I'm drawing a circle around her elbow here with my cursor, I'm circling the right side of the picture, right? Is that her right elbow? No, it's her left elbow, right? Or should I say correct? Okay, so you have to keep your left and right straight for their left and right. Okay. And the very last slide, which I'll kind of actually just jump ahead and show you, is a important reason why. When we describe the parts of the abdomen, okay, you can see there are these sections on the left side of the image that are all actually labeled as the right side, right iliac, right lumbar, etc. And vice versa for the left side. Okay. So that's an important concept to keep straight, because we'll talk about things like the parathyroid glands. There's a right upper parathyroid, there's a right lower parathyroid. There's a left upper, there's a left lower, left inferior. Okay. So keep those straight. That's important. Now, we said she was in a standing position, but, if you're dealing with a cadaver, you're not going to stand them up and look at them. You'd lay them down on the table, okay? An individual that's laying on their back would be in the position known as supine. So if you're a back sleeper, you sleep in the supine position, okay? Versus if you are laying on your tummy and your body is face down, you're in the prone position. So this, if we're pretending she's laying down on a table, this is prone, this is supine. Now, looking at these two pictures, you can see a lot of things are labeled, and there are typically either 2 or 3, a couple of them have a couple extra names. One is a term you probably know commonly as, like the upper arm, or the head, or the elbow. And the other term, which is not in parentheses, is what we call its anatomical term. These are terms that you will need to know, not only for exam 1, for exam 2, all the way through exam 8. Okay? And here is an easy example of why that's important, or why these are important to know. Okay? I have students do this every semester. Everybody point to your biceps muscle. Where your biceps is, right? Okay. Now I say, okay, point to your other biceps, but don't point to your other arm. And then I get the confused look that some of you guys are giving me right now. The biceps muscle that we all know and hold dear, especially guys that like to have big guns, is known as your biceps brachii muscle. And that's because it's in your brachial region. In your brachial region, which is your upper arm, you will find, aside from the biceps brachii, things like the brachial artery, the brachial nerve, brachial vein, a muscle called the brachialis. So these terms are used all semester long, and these are things you'll have to learn at various points. And now I can say, point to your biceps femoris muscle, and you might be able to now know, okay, femoris refers to your femoral region, which is where your thigh is, your upper leg. Your biceps femoris is a big hamstring muscle. Your femoral region is home to your big bone known as the femur. The femoral artery, femoral vein, femoral nerves, those are all in that specific part of the body. So not only will you need to know them now to help you all semester long, there will be times in the semester where I say, remember those words at the beginning of the semester that you had to learn? I'll do that several times this semester. Okay. Now, not only do you need to know them, just, exam question I could ask you, be like, what's the anatomical term for the back of the knee? And then you have like a multiple choice situation and you have to pick popliteal. These two pictures will show up on exam 1. And those are the first 2 pictures that are in your labeling packets that you'll need to fill out and submit prior to exam 1. So what I typically do for pictures like this on exams is I take all of the information away. I can just the blank version of the picture. And I'll make it like worth 4 points or something like that. Give you like 8 things to label. You'll have the picture, you'll have to draw on your arrows and label it in, fill in the answers. What I would not do is just give you the picture like on the front of your labeling packet and say, fill the whole thing out from scratch. Not that mean. I will give you what you need to fill in. Still, that's going to be challenging enough where you have to draw on your arrows. Sometimes if the arrows are already there and you just have to put the correct answer where it's supposed to go. Or sometimes there's arrows with letters associated with them. So I kind of do it a couple of different ways. I'm never just going to give you a picture and say fill it in and make it complete without the information that you need. Make sense? Okay. Let's talk directional terms. As I was saying there on that previous page, one thing that we do a lot of in this class is describe where things are in relationship to one another. We use that anatomical position as our starting point. And we don't like to use terms like above, below, in front of, behind. Instead, we've got some other fancy words. Instead of toward the head or upper part of a structure, we use the word superior. And the opposite of superior is inferior. Okay. Those are terms you hear about in other places, in other ways. You probably have not heard of cephalic or caudal, which are also used. The terms I use 99.5% of the time are superior and inferior. So thinking of like an example, you had to use one of those 2 terms to fill in this sentence, you would use which one? So the shoulder is blank to the elbow. Shoulder is superior. Okay. Now, I can't remember if I told you guys this the other day, but what I do is a lot of times go through and I color things, color code them. Hey, if I didn't tell you guys, you might grab a pack of colored pencils. Okay. If you don't have them, that's fine. Okay. If we did have our colored pencils, we could actually color today these 2 figures because there are arrows, so you can color them in. Letter A would be the arrow that represents superior. What was that? Letter H would be the color that represents inferior. Okay. So those are opposite one another. Don't worry about the other terms in parentheses, just superior and inferior. Now the next 2, anterior, posterior, I also want you to know the term in parentheses. Ventral is the same as anterior, dorsal is the same as posterior. So instead of in front of and behind, we're going to use anterior or posterior. Which letters for my arrows represent, or which letter represents anterior? B. And then letter C would be posterior or dorsal. Medial lateral, if you pretend that there's a imaginary line that runs vertically right down the middle of the body, through your nose, through your chest, through your belly button, down through your groin. The closer you are to that line, the more toward the middle of the body, aren't you? Think medial middle, okay? And the opposite of that is lateral, more towards the side, farther from the midline. So letter D would be medial, letter E would be lateral. Okay. So like using that in a sentence, the heart would be blank to the lungs. Medial. Okay. Now you could also say the next term, intermediate, which means between, and there's not actually an arrow for that in that figure. And we don't use intermediate a whole lot, but you can say the heart is intermediate to the lungs because it's between them. Same thing, we don't use ipsilateral or contralateral very often, and there's not an arrow for those. Ipsilateral means on the same side of the body as another structure, so you can say like your right shoulder and your right ankle are ipsilateral. And then you can say your right shoulder and your left ankle are contralateral, opposite sides. Like I said, we really don't use those very often in this class. Proximal, distal, these are used for like describing things in your limbs, so your arms and legs, okay? Distal sounds a lot like distant, right? Distant means like farther away from. Proximal means closer to, and we're referring to where the joint begins, basically. So where that limb begins, I should say. So either closer to the shoulder, closer to the hip. So earlier we said shoulder is superior to your elbow. If we replaced superior, would we use proximal or distal? Shoulder is proximal to the elbow. So letter F will be proximal, letter G will be distal. And then superficial, also known as external, deep, also known as internal, are letter J and I. Probably pretty common sense, those terms are. Superficial is something we'll use a lot, and same with deep. When we get to like our muscles, we see that there are like sometimes in some places of the body 3 layers of muscle. So we'll have to look at the superficial view, and then we'll remove a muscle so we can see a deeper view, and then we see the deepest view. We take that layer of muscle off. Okay. These 2 figures on the right, not something I'm going to ask you to know for the exam. The one on the left is from our textbook. These I kind of snagged from a different book. I'm not necessarily the most in love with this one from your textbook, but it was in there, so I included it. And then we've got, what is that, 7 more terms I want to talk about. All right, a term that we will come across a lot this semester is lumen. Lumen refers to the hollow center of an organ, just like a hollow area of an organ, like the picture on the right. And maybe that's a blood vessel that's been cut open. If you cut a garden hose and you look inside, okay, anywhere on the inside where the blood would be or where the water would be, if you're looking at a garden hose, would be its lumen. Our stomach has a lumen. Our small intestine, large intestine have lumens. A lot of organs have a lumen. Okay. Central, that's probably pretty common sense. That's the center of an organ or near the center. Peripheral, probably another common sense word, means around the boundary. Those are pretty commonly used terms, not necessarily just in an anatomy class. Whereas medullary and cortical, probably not quite as commonly known. Medullary and cortical are the adjective version of medulla and cortex. Medulla, once again, kind of think middle because it kind of sounds like that, is the inner region of an organ. Cortical or cortex refers to the outer part of an organ. A good example is when we look at our adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are where we produce our adrenaline. The adrenaline that we produce comes from what we would call the adrenal medulla, the middle part. The adrenal cortex is the outer part, which is where we produce other hormones, not at all involved with adrenaline. Okay. And then basal and apical are used when we have a like triangular shaped organ, like this triangle here that I've drawn purposely like that. which is actually the exact same way that our heart is oriented. And that's why I drew it kind of upside down and angled, because your heart is an inverted triangle that's cockeyed, pointing with its tip down toward your left hip. And the tip of your heart is called the apex, the point. And whereas the base is the widest part, or the base of the organ. We see only a few organs, but enough that's super important to understand. Aside from your heart, your lungs have a base and apex because they're fairly triangular. There's a couple others, but we won't worry about them at this point. All right, let's talk about what we call body planes. Body planes are imaginary flat surfaces that pass through the body. You want to think of a body plane kind of like an imaginary pane of glass. And that's kind of a nice visual. In fact, the picture actually kind of really looks with these different planes like they are pieces of glass passing through the body. Okay. The first plane I want to talk about is the sagittal plane, a vertical plane, so it runs like head to toe, and it runs from front to back and thus divides the body into left and right sides. Okay. Since we're looking directly straight on here in our picture, it looks like it's just a line, but if you turn the body 90 degrees, you'll be able to see it kind of like what's shown here with this lady, okay, in the pink one for the frontal plane. Okay. If the line or the plane runs right down the middle of the body or the organ, we'd call it a mid-sagittal plane. Okay? Mid for middle. Pretty straightforward there. If it's off to the side and thus creates unequal left and right sides, we'd call it a parasagittal plane. Pretty hopefully straightforward there. Okay. That frontal plane that I already mentioned is also known as a coronal plane, but frontal is what I use 99% of the time. Is also a vertical plane running from side to side, and it divides the body into anterior and posterior portions, which we just learned. Anterior and posterior are terms instead of using front and back, which if you cheat and you think front and back, it makes it super easy, because front for frontal is what's created and back as well. Make sense? And so that's the pink one here. Okay. The next plane, shown here in green, is a horizontal plane. Anytime you see, and you'll see it a lot this semester, transverse, it means across, like horizontally. Okay? The prefix trans actually means across or through. So it's a horizontal plane that cuts the body into superior and inferior sections. Like if you chop someone's head off, you'd be running in the transverse plane. And believe that is. Another term for transverse plane is cross-sectional horizontal planes. I won't ever really call them that. Transverse is the one you definitely need to know. Not used very often, but still important to understand, is an oblique plane. Passes through the body, not either vertically or horizontally, but somewhere in the middle. Okay, it can do so between the transverse and the sagittal, or between the transverse plane and the frontal plane. So it can kind of go, I use my body like this. I'm not vertical, I'm not horizontal, I'm somewhere in the middle. Or it can go like this. Okay. See how it's different angles there, but still. Now, this figure here, Our Lady with all those planes, would be something you'll want to study for the exam. Make sure you can identify those planes. Over on the right side, we show what you can do with those planes in performing a dissection. And literally the word section is in dissection. A section is a cut of the body or one of its organs made along one of the planes just described. If we get to do it in lab, we're going to perform a mid-sagittal section to the sheep brain, cutting it along that sagittal plane, mid-sagittal plane specifically, creating equal left and right sides of the brain and being able to see the internal features. If you were to cut the front of the plane or front of the brain off, you perform a frontal section. Or if you cut the top of the brain so you can look down into it, you'd be performing a transverse section. We will look at pictures all semester long where we're seeing something after a mid-sagittal section or a parasagittal section has been done, or a transverse section, or a frontal section. So figures on the right, not worried about, a nose, just this one on the left, and then obviously know what a section is. We should be able to finish this slide and we'll call it a day. All right, let's talk about what we call body cavities. Body cavities are spaces within our body where we find probably our most important organs, things like the brain and the spinal cord, the heart, your stomach, your intestines. Okay, so they protect, separate, and support these various internal organs. We can break them down into those that are anterior ventral and those that are posterior dorsal. In other words, those that are closer to the front of the body and those that are closer to the back side of the body. Okay. Down at the bottom of an illustration to show them off. On the left here from the lateral view, on the right from just a straight on anterior view. Let's talk about the thoracic cavity shown here in blue, also known as the chest cavity, formed by the ribs, muscles of the chest, sternum, and the thoracic portion of our vertebral column. So this is where you'd find, like your lungs and your heart. Okay. Now your lungs and your heart are actually found within smaller cavities inside that larger cavity, because there's some membranes that surround those organs. Okay. Surrounding each lung is a right and left pleural cavity. Anytime you see the term pleura or pleural, it's a dead giveaway that you're dealing with the lungs. Around your heart is what we call a pericardial cavity. Anytime you see cardia or cardiac, that refers to the fact that you're dealing with the heart. There's a kind of anatomical imaginary spot in the middle of our thoracic cavity. Its midpoint is called the mediastinum. And so you'll see that term once in a while this semester. It's not something you can see labeled here, nor, since the lungs and the heart are not included, you won't find the pleural or pericardial cavities. Now, separating the thoracic cavity from this large green cavity is a muscle that allows us to breathe, called the diaphragm. Okay. And below that diaphragm is this large abdominal pelvic cavity, which, as it states, extends from the diaphragm to the groin. You can further subdivide that very large cavity into the abdominal cavity, which is superior, and the pelvic cavity, which is inferior. Now notice in both pictures there's a dotted line to separate them, and you have to understand that that's an imaginary line. It's not a real thing, But there is a spot, and it's basically just the top of your hips. From below that point would be the pelvic cavity. Anything above that would be the abdominal cavity. You can see I've listed off which organs belong where. More of your reproductive organs and urinary organs are down in the pelvic cavity. Digestive organs and some other organs are up in your your abdominal cavity. Collectively, any organ that's located in your thoracic or abdominal pelvic cavity, we will call those organs viscera. So you'll see the term visceral a lot this semester. Visceral organs include like your lungs, your heart, stomach, spleen, kidneys, bladder, so on and so forth. Two dorsal or posterior cavities exist. Your cranial cavities, where your brain is, formed by the cranial bones. And then the vertebral cavity or spinal cavity, which they have listed here as the canal, same thing, is found within the spinal column, formed by the vertebrae, houses the spinal cord. Now, both your spinal cord and your brain are very delicate tissues, and the bones that surround them are not. So to protect your brain and spinal cord are these three protective tissues known as meninges, dura mater, rectum mater, pia mater, that we'll talk about later on in the semester. I do want you to be able to identify these two pictures, so make sure you commit those to memory. All right, we are at 12:50, so we will stop here. You'll have two slides that you'll have to get the notes from the videos I'll send out, or video, it'll only be one. So